Dudes with wrenches here. What are we doing today? Well, I'll tell you, it's gonna make me crazy. It's a little bit insane. Make me think all the intensive mind thoughts I shouldn't have. And that's working on a parts car. You heard me right. We bought a car for parts off the old marketplace. Been in a barn since 1981. I want to flash that out there like it's special or something. And really sell the idea that we're going to make her run, right? I mean, that's what everybody's here to see. Making something run. Is it a good idea? Probably not. It's probably a horrible idea. But when you own a bunch of them and everybody tells you, hey, don't ruin that perfectly good car for parts, you should see if it runs. You at least gotta give that a shot. You know, see how good the parts you have actually are. And maybe along the way, you fall in love with said project, and you feel bad about actually tearing it apart, and you save it, and you resurrect it, and you say, oh man, I love car revivals, and I'm just that kind of guy. I'm not. I'm just kind of a hoarder. I keep things I don't need. I buy stuff I don't have that I definitely don't need. And I buy more things for parts for the things that I already have that I'm currently not working on. And then I just kind of let them all sit. And I guess that's my goal. You know, my mentals, they tell me I should be doing things with these things. And maybe that's what we're doing here. We're just doing things with things we already have. We're putting it on the internet for some accountability on what we've already done and purchased. Maybe this is the visualization of regret. Maybe this is what obsession looks like. Maybe this is what a bad addiction becomes. I'm not a therapist. I can't diagnose my actual problem. So come along with us. Hopefully you stay till the end and watch us put this 1967 Galaxie convertible back on the road. Hopefully. Maybe. Ah! It's El dragging that tire. Oh, it's in park. Oh, it's in park. We didn't take it out of park. That's wow. Okay. Oh, there she is. Look, it rolls. Yeah. There's raccoon poo in here. So let's recap what the hired help just pulled off here. They untarped a car, they pulled it out of the yard, they fixed a flat tire with electrical tape and zip ties, and they forgot to take it out apart. Sometimes you definitely get what you paid for. It's in here. Now, that front tire did definitely make it out of the yard and into the garage, but it is not holding air, and it is in a bad way as far as condition. This guy could almost put his fingers in there, and that's never a good tire. So what you want to do is, you want to destroy it. You want to destroy that tire so you don't keep getting them urges to keep reusing a rotted old bad tire that barely holds air, because it will hurt you someday. So make it not a good tire. Now, most of the time for safety purposes, we like to leave the jack stands on the lowest setting. You can't fall down if you're on the lowest setting, you know. It does make it hard to get underneath the car. We'll regret that later, for sure. Now, one might think that a car put away in 1980, being originally from 1967, in a barn sheltered, would be in great condition. Well, this one obviously was wrecked at some point. It has a green fender and door, and barns are very rarely airtight. A lot of dirt blows in, a lot of critters get in, and you can blame the top and the interior on this car to the trash pandacoots of the world, aka raccoons, the worst animals that can get into a car, and they ruin everything. So let's check out some treasures that we did find, even though everything was destroyed and gone. And that's this very ideal 30-cent parking pass. You know, this was a better day and time when you could park for a week for $1.50. Also, M&Ms with an expiration date of 1979. That really proves the age of when this thing was put away. Now to the meat and potatoes of this parts car, and that's the 390. Now, she's not the big 4-barrel high-output version by any means, but this was an ideal power plant for its day. We did originally think this was a C6 car, but it is not. It is a Cruise-O-Matic, which sadly is not great, but you know, it's not the end of the world. These FE motors or powerhouses, they're expensive to build, but having a 392 barrel that potentially runs was worth every penny we spent on this parts car. Now here we go again, checking all those important fluids on a motor that's potentially locked up. This motor does not turn by hand very easy. It feels like it rocks a little bit. You get a little bit of movement in her, but she don't turn. We haven't put a big ratchet on it yet by any means, and we don't really want to until we check the cylinders. So we're just making sure it has vital fluids, and those vital fluids aren't playing with each other. They're not in the same places, you know, like antifreeze and oil in the antifreeze, and things where they're just not supposed to be. Now, something to remember when you're working on critter-ridded and trash bandicoot cars, everything is filthy. When you pull anything out, like spark plugs, you definitely want to vacuum all those spaces because you don't need any extra bits down inside the motor that you didn't want before. Now, this thing's actually looking pretty clean inside. I don't see any major issues, at least on the first piston. I suggest tracking and marking everything you take off and put back on. It's not that you have to. You can just know the firing order, know where things go, and trace it all out. But this is a foolproof plan to just knowing where things go back to. Don't mark it in any real way, just so you know where it goes back. Effectively confusing anyone who may be trying to help you with this project. It's a foolproof plan to make sure everybody else is fooled. Now, as you notice this guy is popping these plugs and lubing these holes, you notice his penetrating oil of preference is seafoam. You can use whatever you want. He's definitely tried them all. This does happen to be the best product for him. There's always going to be heat and a hammer. That's always a better option than penetrating oil. But when we're trying to break open an engine, that's what we're using. Just to point it out. Now, pro tip, if you're going to be doing a lot of work on your motor, a big step is just remove the hood. Just take it off and get rid of it. It doesn't need to be there. Probably get a friend. Probably get somebody to help you. That'd be a great idea. Don't do it by yourself. There's a good chance you could try to break the windshield or hurt yourself or hurt the hood or hurt the car. We're not really worried about that with this one, but we probably still should have gotten help. Definitely, this guy needs to learn from his own mistakes by breaking a few windshields, I guess. Come on, guy, why are you holding that pole? It already fell down once, and now you're just gonna pull the hood down onto it? That's definitely gonna work. Didn't work at all. Good job. Way to try to break something you didn't want to replace. Now, even better. You're just gonna grab the hood and carry it off. Like, that's a good idea. I wonder why our back hurts. You're doing this to us. This is why we feel this way. You know, back in 1967, they were trying to sell these cars in a lot of crazy ways, and Galaxie was definitely on the list for crazy ways. But one of the few slogans I read that didn't make a whole lot of sense in the Ford slogan market was, "A Ford by any other name would cost a lot more." Which doesn't make sense. I don't know if they were competing against Mercury or Lincoln. I mean, they're also Fords, kinda, I guess. I don't know if they're really comparing themselves to a Cadillac with luxury, if you will. Believe my last car had a luxury name and unfortunately a luxury price. Yeah, that's common sense marketing, I would think. And then their bigger slogan was, "Quieter because it's stronger. Stronger because it's better built. Ford." Now, I don't know what quieter has to do with stronger, but evidently Ford really liked to sell the idea that sound meant a stronger car. Oh boy, here we go. We're finally going to crank this thing over, and it does not look like it's going well. This is going badly. We've put the oil in the motor. We've done all the things we're supposed to do. We've checked all the cylinders. We've greased. We've put air in there. And we've blown out all the gunk. There was nothing to be said that was really all that bad, but this thing does not turn over. It is not easy. It is very hard. So I think the solution here is definitely remove the fan and go with a bigger ratchet. Something we can really get in there and just crank on her, see if we can get her unstuck. Ford did do something smart, because I feel like they knew their motors were going to get stuck. They put a really good girthy bolt on their front of them, so you could really get after it. Not like a Chevy who was just running a small bolt, because they just assumed that wouldn't happen. Now, I know what you're saying. He put the mark on the belt. That's going to tell you nothing. He knows. He's just trying to make sure he makes a full revolution of some kind. It's not about a full revolution of the motor, it's just about marking something for a visual reference to say that we've turned the motor over enough times to call it a full revolution. And the mark on the belt definitely does that. Now that this guy has the motor turning a little bit, I think it's a good idea, and so does he, obviously, because he's the guy doing it and all. He's going to vacuum the rest of this motor off, because there's no reason to get extra things inside your motor that don't belong. So while he's doing that, we're going to talk about 1967, and why maybe you don't see the Galaxie as much as you should nowadays, even though it was a really prominent car, and it did well for the year. Ford wasn't doing too bad selling things at that time, but they did have the problem with the Mustang was their top seller since '65, and everybody wanted a pony car by that time. The big luxury full-size cars were still making good sales, but they were waning comparably to the pony car market. People had other options now, and they were taking those other options for a smaller, sportier car. And in 1967, we all know Chevy was definitely putting a beating on Ford. Not in sales by any means, because the Mustang was still selling more, but the '67 Camaro and Firebird definitely put a niche in the armor when it came to the large car market on all fronts, in the GM world, in the Ford world, etc. The pony car craze was on the rise. Did that hose clamp just bend the tip of that screwdriver? Throw that thing away. Jeez, what are you doing? Stop. Don't take it back out of the garbage. We finally put it in the garbage. Okay, I know how this works. Moving on. Well, that hose is being a little stubborn. Let's talk about repurposing a tool that was never really built for the purpose we're going to use it for. And that's a PVC cutter. A ratcheting one, might I add. Works great to cut rubber hoses. Now, as you notice, he's removing the stubborn block heater. Now, this was a Minnesota car, so you can understand why it had a block heater. Not that I'd be driving a convertible in the winter, but those Minnesota people are built a little different, don't you know, when you start talking about cold weather and how cold it can really get before you stop doing things like driving convertibles. All right, let's stop doing that. Now, it doesn't get really addressed in this video, to tell you the truth, but we did look in this trunk, and there is tire chains in there. So that means this vehicle was driven not only in cold weather, but it was driven on ice and snow. And I'm gonna tell you what, you go back in the day, and there was some people out there with some real skill. They didn't have ABS, they didn't have traction control, heck, they didn't even have power steering and power brakes on some of these rigs. And they were willing to put tire chains on the back of a convertible with a 390 and just send it. Just cinder right through the snow and the storms to get where they needed to go, because there wasn't a lot of ability to just buy multiple cars. If you committed to the idea of owning a convertible Galaxie, you were fully committed to that idea. And if we really think about it, 1967, four-wheel drives weren't really relevant. Everybody owned a two-wheel drive truck or a car. So when you needed to get around, tire chains was just how you got it done. You didn't need big fancy snow tires or anything like that. The best traction you can possibly come with is just chain up and get her done. Now let's go back to this guy, since he's done cutting off all the old rotten hoses and getting rid of all the factory gas system. And does anybody else have a giant bowl of keys that's highly unsorted? We did tag these at one time, so that's a good option. And we just dig through when we find what we need. Look, the key actually works, that's important. And now we can put the battery in. And it's always good to make sure when you put your battery in, you don't get the sparky sparks when you hit them against the posts there, because that's going to tell you definitely have a wiring issue somewhere before you start. Now, we do not have headlights, which that proves there's definitely a wiring problem somewhere, but we indeed have a starter, which makes this all worth it. And that's all that really matters, is we can turn the key and hear the motor turn. And this one's making an awful noise, so he's going to dive right into pulling all these accessory pieces, potentially to find whatever this noise may be, because that high squealing noise, that's not natural. That's not a noise you should be hearing when a motor is turning, so what's mostly just probably going to be a bad alternator, power steering pump, potentially water pump, but you never know until you start pulling things and spinning them. That's a much better turning over noise. Now we're going to check the electrical digitals, and we're going to make sure we actually have power going to the coil, from the coil all the way over to the nice point system. And we're going to fix some wiring. That's a big problem on this one. The wiring from the actual point system to the coil, well, somebody put a Scotch lock in there. Scotch locks are the devil. Don't use them. They're a bad idea. Now, I know what you're saying. Why did you crimp that on there like that to put that temporary wire in? Well, it's more of a temporary permanent solution. It may be long-term depending on how far this motor gets going, but for right now, this works. And it will work the whole time, just to troubleshoot where we actually have power and if these points are actually going to function and this car is actually going. I would like to point out there's nothing wrong with points and condensers set up there. You can go HEI, you can spend money, you can do whatever you want. But in this aspect, we're just trying to see if we can get a motor to run. And we don't need to do anything expensive. If we can get the points and condenser, we're going to put it in. If we can just clean these ones and they work, we're going to leave them alone. Hence, all the temporary setup that we're putting together here. Now, as you notice, we're cleaning all these fancy plugs, because here again, we don't need to replace something we don't know is actually broken. And if you pay attention to these plugs, Champion plugs were a factory plug by Ford before they bought Autolite. AC was a factory General Motors plug, and that was even before they became AC Delco. So somebody has definitely been here before, but what we're doing now is turning over the motor without plugs in it to try to build some oil pressure. Yes, I know, this is not incredibly good on the starter, but the starter works, and we're just going to spin this thing up to try to get that oil pump moving to circulate some oil in the motor before we try to fire it up. Because trying to fire a dry motor is a bad idea. Don't do that. This motor's been sitting a long time. It's a good idea to make sure the oil's actually moving around inside of it. Because there's absolutely no reason to hurt a perfectly good parts car motor when that's why we bought the whole car. Now, you're probably saying, but this car looks amazing. Yes, it is. It's a pretty decent car when you look at it. It has a great frame. It has a decent body. The interior, it's gone. You can replace interiors, but that's neither here nor there. But little fun fact about 1967 Galaxies. Having a good frame under one is kind of incredible in general. They didn't make the frames very well in 67. There's an old story I was told at one time that said they were trying to be part of NASCAR, so they were trying to make them lighter, so they made the frame's a little thinner in those years. I don't know if that's really that accurate. It's just what I've been told. So I'm not going to call it fact, but there you go. You have a little bit of piece of something. That being said, frames in the 60s weren't generally that good anyway. They were made out of thin steel. They weren't welded well. The production just wasn't there. It doesn't matter the company that was actually making them. People like to think that 60s cars were bigger and stronger and better, but that really wasn't true until the 70s. 60s cars were actually made pretty weak, thin steel, thin frames. They're actually a lot lighter than you'd think for their size. But to get back to what this guy's actually doing, he did roll the motor over and check for spark with a fancy little tool on one of the spark plugs, and indeed, there was no spark. Now, most of the time, when you clean points, you might as well just replace them. And points that have been sitting for a long time, they're probably not going to work. We knew that going in, but we wanted to try anyway, because like we said, no reason to replace something that's actually going to work. And you can tell by the fact that we have fire now, the points and condenser fixed the spark issue.
Maybe the other bowl was bad.
Yeah, maybe they were.
Yeah. Do you want me to try to start?
Just turn it over. Okay. Magic! I don't know what's on fire down there. I have a feeling there's potentially mouse nest in that manifold right there.
Well, they're not going to be there for long.
Yeah, we're smoking them out. We're going to let that burn. I mean, it's contained, right?
Yep.
Good job, 390. Good job.
Well, that is quite amazing. First time this thing's really ran since 1980s. And, well, we ran into the next problem and we learned a few things. Maybe when you think your motor's stuck, actually check all your accessories, because your accessories definitely could be stopping your motor from turning over by hand, and we did waste a lot of time trying to unstick a not stuck motor due to a water pump that was definitely stuck. So now we're going to tear this all apart and replace all of the cooling system realistically outside of the radiator to get this thing to where we can actually run the motor for a time period, get it warmed up, get everything moving, get those rings reseated, and get that water flowing through there and actually see if anything holds water. Now as this guy tears apart and replaces this water pump and gets her all cleaned up so that new one can go on all fancy style, let's talk about what we're actually really doing here and just how crazy our brain feels when we're doing things like this. This car was definitely bought for parts. We have another Galaxie. It's a 289 car and it ran decent for a while, but it was also a barn find. And I'll tell you what, it probably should have got some new rings put in the motor when we got it. We knew it smoked, we knew it had sat for a lot of years, and somebody had just put it back on the road. They found it in a barn and made it run. And we tried to resurrect it. We tried to bring it back to life and make it a reliable car. And we did get some good miles out of it. We got some good years out of it. And then, like things do, all the problems start rearing their little heads. And with that car, we should have just pulled the motor, re-ring, bearing, and gasket it, and we would have been fine. And we still can. There's nothing wrong with the 289. It's not completely dead, but it smokes. It smokes so bad. And, you know, that can happen. You put these things back on the road, and new fuels and new oils and all these new things in these old motors, they don't like it. They don't like running with all these new chemical compounds. They don't like ethanol. They don't like all the things that seep past all those old, dry, and rotten seals. These motors ran on leaded fuel, so leaded fuel allowed the rings to seat better. And here's something people don't like to hear. These older cars didn't see 150,000 miles, 200,000 miles. They were well worn out by 65, 70 and did need a little bit of a rebuild, which the common guy could do. It wasn't that big a deal. A shop could do it for you for a fair price. And at the end of the day, these cars didn't have a lot of value. You just went and got another one. And that's a perfect example of this car right here. A man owned it, he loved it, he drove it, and it got wrecked. He put a new fender and door on it, and then he found a nicer car, and this one got stuck in the barn. And it got kept, because you never know, you might need parts for your red 67 convertible that was definitely there when I bought this one. And the 67, well, it was a lot more worn out, a lot more used, a lot more miles. But it was a higher option car. But back to this guy. He looks like he's got the water pump on there now, and now he's got a fuel pump going. Because, you know, why do something right when you can just do it wrong? We've created a deadline for ourselves. We wanted to get this car in the garage and out of the garage in a 2-week period. And to do that, we can't fix everything, and that includes the fuel system. The tank still has a lot of gas in it, and we're not willing to see what that's going to do to the motor. And it's caved in quite a bit, so it needs a new fuel tank altogether, and potentially new lines, and all the rubber we cut off needs to be replaced because it is all rotten, and I would not trust it to hold fuel. So that is why we're putting a temporary fuel pump right on the core support. And just like that, the motor is running with a functional fuel system. And it actually has a carburetor spring, so we can do a little rev from the captain's seat of this land barge convertible. Because now that I think about it, it's not a cool convertible to me, in my opinion, unless it's a good, large cruiser car. I've never been a fan of small roadster type convertibles. But I've never been a huge fan of convertibles in general. Not having a roof just makes me think, why aren't we on a motorcycle? If you want the wind in your face, there's better ways of doing that. I mean, a car is still going to be more secure than that, but is it really if it doesn't have a roof? I mean, I guess it's all in how you drive it at the end of the day. But let's move on. Let's go back to what we're doing over here. And would you look at that? Those are some really meaty meaty old bias ply tires on the back. That really confirms, along with the tire chains we talked about before, this thing was a go-getter in the winter. Let me tell you what. Aunt Barbara wasn't getting stuck at the church after the bake sale in the snowstorm. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. We're waiting on some parts to get a coolant system together, so while we're doing that, we're going to move right on to the brakes. And to do the brakes, we're going to have to get inside this car and lay on the floor. And to lay on the floor, we have to remove the trash Pandacoot poopies. Now, sadly, this isn't the only pile that we need to remove, but this is the one that we have to lay in right now, so it definitely has to go away. And we're not only going to remove it, we're going to grind it from the floor, because I don't know if I explained this before, the smell inside this car is, well, quite awful. It's real bad, and all these things have embedded themselves in the metal. And not only are they embedded in the metal, it's not a bad idea just to get rid of some of this cancerous rust and get this all kind of sealed up and cleaned. Now we are going to clean the interior. As you can see, it is quite disgusting as well. We do need to sit on it and actually hold on to the steering wheel without catching some kind of disease. So that is why we're just going to spray it all down and make it pretty again, so that we, could like lick the steering wheel if we wanted to, or eat off of it. I'm not sure why I said that. The intrusive thoughts in my brain are telling me to lick the steering wheel now. Don't do that. Don't lick the steering wheel. That's a bad idea. We're not doing that, everybody. It's not going to come up in this video. It may have happened off the scene. It didn't happen. Okay. And just like that, a little kneeling pad and a shipping blanket, and boom, we have fresh new interior again. Now, if you caught that right there, that was indeed the brake pedal breaking free, because it was definitely stuck. And now we're just going to throw her in and out of gear, because there is zero brakes, might I add. And we're just going to see if this differential moves. And it does! And that is the magic of knowing you have a transmission. Now that we're done doing that, we're going to spray some stuff on the floor to seal in all of that half-rusty goodness. Alrighty, slow down, guy. Come on, we're just trying to talk here. So we're tearing apart the brakes now, I guess. So we're going to tear apart this front hub. Ford did things a little different than your standard Chevy. I'm not sure on Dodge. I haven't worked on that many of them from the 60s, obviously. But you had to pull the whole hub and drum in one unit. So you actually had to pull all the bearing out, unadjust your drum, and just shank her off, and pray that your adjuster actually unadjusts. And boom, there you go. You have brakes you can now work on. We don't see any bad hardware, and the shoes actually are not completely worn out. So on to the master cylinder. And well, it's bad. It's real bad. We can't do anything with this. We could potentially clean it out and, redo the bores and rebuild it. We bought a cheap one from the parts store because why not? It's just easier and quicker. Did I mention that deadline part? Now you may be asking, what is this guy doing? Never heat brake lines. Hydraulic fluid turns to smoke when you boil it. But I didn't want to replace the little lines that go down to the little proportioning valve because that seemed hard. They're like a foot long and I'd have to bend them and stuff. So we just wanted to break these ones free and reuse them. And because the system is open and just horribly bad, it isn't that big a deal. We wound our little heat coil on there and we just heated them, and they broke right free. It worked out great. Don't do this to a sealed brake system, might I add. Don't do it. Now, after bench blading the master cylinder, we had to put the actual rod in the back of there. There's a hog ring on the end of that rod. Snaps right in and it holds itself in there, and then you swing it on into the car and you bolt it down. And then you have a problem because you didn't measure the actual push rod, and you can't buy another master cylinder because it took a week to get this one. So I guess we're going to tear the old rod out of the old master cylinder and put it in the new master cylinder, because that's definitely what you should have to do when you buy brand new parts. Now, the right thing would be to go get the right part with the right length rod, but we're here, we have the ability, we have the tools, let's get this done. It was not easy. The brand new rod we put in pulled out pretty easy, but the old rod in the old master cylinder, it fought us. It actually fought pretty hard. And we would have not had this problem if we would have just measured it from the get-go. I'm not really sure what the problem was when they sold me this part. It does say that it's for manual brakes, so I'm not sure why the rod was too long. But when we tried to bolt the master cylinder up to the firewall, we couldn't tighten it any farther before the pedal was at its stop, so this had to happen. A half inch is too much of a difference. And just like that, we're ready to reinstall our new master cylinder with our old rod. We did have to make our own hog ring, but we don't need to explain to you how that's a bad idea. It stays in there, and that's what's important. So now, whoop, goes right back into the car as it should, and goes right together. No issues, no problems. I would like to point out that this is one of those times that aftermarket parts will bite you. This was a cheap master cylinder. We did have to order it, which is the worst part about it, and it came to us wrong. Also, the lid doesn't fit very well, and it leaks all over because the seal is not very good. We can take the rod off and probably bend it and add some more tension, but this is a common issue with aftermarket master cylinders. They're just not made all the same, and we don't know how many times these things have been rebuilt or recast or made off of old dies. But do pay attention when you buy cheap master cylinders because you don't really want them to fail. Probably should have spent more money here, but it's the one we could get, not the one we wanted. Now right into the brakes. We have no need to try to bleed brakes with these old rubber hoses. Even if they work, they're not going to work for long. If everything in the master cylinder was seized up and bad, and everything in the wheel cylinders is seized up and bad, the hoses are definitely seized up and bad. And that's a perfect example here. Also, little thing, don't use your hands as hammers. This guy does, that's why his hands hurt. He's not always the brightest guy. He just hits things real hard until they come apart. And you know, that's a problem. Now here's another gripe. Our brand new hoses didn't come with copper crush washers. We probably should have checked that when we got them, but we didn't, so we're just gonna reuse these. Not a real big issue. And then we're going to bleed the brakes. This is gonna be good. All we had to do is change the hoses and bam! Optimism is key when you're doing projects like this. Just try every little piece knowing that it's going to break, probably. Waste your time putting singular items on when you should just strip everything and start over. And that's what we did here. I mean, the bleeder came out. That's a perfectly good sign. And instead of, going and getting a new bleeder, which we could definitely do, we're going to clean this one and we're going to make it good because you don't really need to replace bleeders. As long as they come out, then the corners are still corners and you can get a socket on them. They're fine. Just reuse them. Now, this is a perfect example of we should be replacing the inner seal and the bearings and just going through these wheel bearings, but these will probably work good enough for what we're trying to get done here. We have to make sure this car runs and moves and drives before we care about a lot of these maintenance items. We gave ourselves a deadline, remember? Now we're going to show you how this goes together because cameras don't like grease. And then bam, look, now it's all greased and it's ready to go back on. So let's clean out the actual brake shoes and all the hardware with some brake clean and lube up the old spindle and slip this thing all back together. Now, I could show you how to set this wheel bearing, but I don't need your internet judgment on me. There's a lot of good ways to do it. There's a lot of bad ways to do it. This bearing needs replaced, so we're just putting it in there and making it work. And then we're just going to slap that cap on and be ready to go. Now let's go ahead and bleed those brakes and see what happens. We changed nothing but the rubber hoses, and oh my, look, a line ruptured. But wait! Look, movie magic. All the front lines have been replaced, plus the front wheel cylinders, and everything was gone through. But we're moving on to the hoses now. We finally got all the coolant system together, so now we can actually put water in this thing and see what happens. And don't judge me, that flex hose was the only thing I could buy. And remember that deadline we keep talking about? It doesn't matter. It's a hose that holds water, and that's what's important. Would you look at that fancy belt we just put on there? It fits so great. And look, we're even bolting back on the Finger Chopper 5000. Bright orange, might I add, so you can see it with your good eye, because my depth perceptions, they don't exist. Parts store sold us the wrong belt. That's the best thing ever. So guess what? We're going to use the old 40-year-old belt, because deadlines and whatever. We're just trying to make this video happen. Let's go! Now let's get this thing running and turned up and get it up to temperature and see what actually holds together. But weirdly enough, it doesn't want to idle anymore. It doesn't want to run. There's something going on and we need to check out why a car that ran for 2 minutes doesn't want to run for 10. Weird. Now we're going to check the plugs and wires because it sounds like it has a miss. And wow, look, the old plugs we stuck back on, they're really not holding together. And it's not running any better once we replaced that one single plug that I knew wasn't clicking onto the spark plug very well. And if we're gonna check the plugs and make sure they're not completely fouled out or just ruined, let's just replace all of them. You know, while we're here, let's just throw parts at it. We're not mechanics, we're just parts throwers. Pick your parts, throw them at there. To be truthful, we put all the original stuff on because we wanted to make sure everything worked. And we're going to put new stuff on because we know we're there already, but we can't properly tune anything if we don't know if we have proper spark plugs or wires. Not to say that any of the new stuff's worth putting on either. It's not like we've had a lot of good times with fresh parts store parts on this build, but here we are. We're putting new stuff on, and once the new stuff's on, we'll be able to tweak and tune that carburetor and figure out what exactly is going on so we can get this thing up to temperature and see how she runs. Weirdly enough, not any better. We definitely have a vacuum leak somewhere, probably an old rotten gasket or, you know, something we did. There was definitely some bad spark plug wires on there, but the plugs weren't terrible. We retuned the entire carb. We put it back to a baseline and retuned it from there, all the idle screws. And we did get it to idle, and we did get it to warm up and cycle. But now we need to change that oil because that was the whole point. Get it warm enough to drain the oil and get it to remove some of the bad things that are inside of this engine so we can put that new, fresh, gorgeous oil inside there to give her all the lubricant she needs to be a good little motor. Now, after putting new oil in it, we're going to fire this thing up, and we retuned it and did find a huge vacuum leak on the back of the carb. That was on us. And once we got that repaired, oh boy, does she run good now. Just hit the key and she purrs. Now, you'll notice it sounds like an old International here, but that's because we have an exhaust manifold that has left the chat. And as you can tell, we got a little fire coming out of there. Cracked manifolds will do that, but don't think it's an engine knock. It's just an exhaust leak. Don't worry about it. Now you will notice that there's no brakes. This is the rear, that is a wheel cylinder, there's nothing attached. And you're gonna go, you can't do that. Well, we're indeed gonna roll the dice on this one because we're kind of done with brakes. If you wanna watch brakes, go watch the last video. We did a lot of brakes on that one, and this time we just didn't have the parts. We couldn't get them, and I wasn't willing to replace all the lines. Those rear wheel cylinders are indeed seized. There's no fluid coming past them. And due to that, we did not want them to just loosen up a little and lock up our rear brakes. So we opted to just remove the brakes altogether and run it without. It has front brakes, they work great. 1967 was the first year for a dual pop master cylinder, and because it has a dual pop master cylinder, even if we were to have a leak in the back and lose all the fluid, we would still indeed have front brakes. This is very important. Do not do this with a single pot master cylinder unless you say have an emergency brake available. Now, moving on to the next safety concern, we did move our portable gas tank to the opposite side of where the manifold was spitting fire, so I think that's important to note, and we just strapped down an old 2-gallon right to the front grill as our temporary fuel cell system. We did make it a nice little neck to go in there and have a weighted brass fitting on the end, which indeed is actually a filter out of a carburetor, so it acts as a filter and a weight, and its ability to keep this thing moving down the road. And oh boy, does it give it a classy look that you can't get any other way than redneck engineering. Now this car wouldn't be road ready without a few more ratchet straps to hold the battery in. And then we get to put the old air cleaner back on. Now this is another item that took way too long to get. I had a special order around air cleaner. What's the craziness with this, people? We can't get regular old car parts anymore. Belts, air cleaners, etc. And now we're gonna let this thing down on the ground and hopefully get her going to be able to drive this thing. Finally, we get to drive it. But wait a second, we forgot that old broken exhaust, and we can't be safety conscious drivers without removing it, because I'd hate to see it fall off and have somebody run over it and hurt one of their tires. Now, you gotta rip all that old junk off, so all you people out there cruising around with mufflers and exhaust dangling under your car with wires, just get rid of it. Your car's loud either way, come on. All right, it's almost time. We're getting her down on the ground. Let's get in this thing and fire it up and take it out of the garage. I think it's time to do the thing we've all been waiting for, the drive around. We've made it. The car is a running and driving car again. And everybody knows what that means. Cue the inspirational music. Parts car driving. Once was parts, and now it's a car. Parts car driving. Whole life decision.
Godspeed, Captain.
I think a good first test of this being roadworthy is testing the brakes against the motor, and they hold. And they hold good. It actually doesn't push past the front brakes, which is always a good thing when all you have is front brakes. And now that we've proven that the brakes are an idea, now let's try the gas. Hammer down and send this thing down the road, because why not? Now, Ford was trying to sell me on this idea of buying this car back in the 60s, like I was around back in the 60s, but that's neither here nor there. That it was stronger, and it was quieter, and it was quieter, and it was stronger, and it was strong because it was quiet, etc. But the fact of the matter is, this car is not quiet. It doesn't fit any of those bills. Technically, it's stronger than its predecessors of previous than 67, but compared to LTDs of the 70s, not very, but the lines are good, and that's what I appreciate about it. And it did just return to the road, so that kind of proves some strength and durability, I guess, that it could sit for so long and still be a functioning car. This car has been trapped in a barn longer than I've been alive, and we've liberated it, and that was a victory in my book. So let's just put it through its paces, even in this small area, to gather our thoughts on what's the next step with this car. Do we just take this motor out and stick it in our other 67 Galaxie as intended? Potentially maybe use the frame under another Galaxie we definitely own that we didn't talk about. There's a lot of good things here. Or do we just call it a car? It's not a parts car anymore, it's a car. I don't love convertibles, but maybe I've just never had one I actually enjoyed. And I do enjoy 60s cars, so it's hard for me to say anything bad about it because I enjoy the lines, I enjoy the look. And being the convertible and the ratty mess that it is strangely growing on me. I know there's going to be a time when I regret everything I've done right here, probably in about 5 minutes. But for right now, in this driver's seat, I feel complete. I feel as I'm in a car that I could enjoy driving and have a good time. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be nice. When you're spending a low dollar amount to get a car out of a barn, the expectations should match. So, there it is. Another car rescued, another car revived, however you want to say it. Really, you can't drive this car anywhere. It needs quite a few more things. But, in a short list, finish the brakes, put a gas system in it, and put a top and a hood back on it, and it is something you could drive to a local show. There's nothing wrong with it. And really, we don't have that much invested in it. It wasn't a horrible idea to take this simple parts car and put it back on the road as a car. We might go further than this. We might not. Hey, it might end up in the backyard again under a tarp. But at least we can say we did something than let it sit and rot into the grass. So thanks for coming, everybody. We really appreciate it. And just remember, a 67 Galaxie convertible is strong because it's quiet, I guess. It's not at all. It's actually pretty loud. I'm not sure why that's a good slogan. It's not. Have a good day.